There's a particular quality to memory that makes certain decades feel more distant than they actually are. The 1960s in Australia sits in that strange place now, close enough that many of us remember it or heard stories from those who lived it, yet far enough away that the texture of daily life has changed entirely. When we think about the 60s, we often recall the landmark moments: the construction of the Sydney Opera House, the arrival of decimal currency in 1966, the referendum that same year that finally counted Aboriginal Australians in the census. These were important turning points, but beneath those headlines there was simply the business of living, going to work, raising children, getting through each day. And it's those unremarkable details that seem to slip away first without anyone quite noticing when they disappeared. If you walked down a suburban street in Australia during the 1960s, you'd notice the sounds before anything else. Early morning brought the soft rattle of the milk truck making its rounds. Glass bottles clinked as they were set down on doorsteps. The milkman knew which houses wanted full cream and which wanted skim. He knew who was away on holiday and who'd recently had a baby and needed extra. This wasn't just a transaction. It was a relationship built over years of Wednesday mornings and Saturday payments. The bottles themselves were beautiful in their simplicity, thick glass with foil or cardboard tops. In winter, the cream would freeze and push the cap up. In summer, you'd rush to bring them inside before they warmed. When you were finished, you'd rinse the bottles and leave them on the doorstep for collection. The system required trust. Trust that the milk would arrive. Trust that you'd settle your bill. Trust that nobody would steal the bottles from your step. The bread came the same way. Not every day in most places, but several times a week. The baker's van would pull up, and you'd smell the loaves before you saw them. They were wrapped simply, sometimes just in waxed paper. The bread lasted a day or two before going stale, but that was expected. Nobody thought bread should last a week. You bought it fresh, and you ate it while it was good. And it wasn't just milk and bread. The greengrocer came through selling vegetables from his truck. The knife grinder would set up on the corner, sharpening scissors and kitchen knives while you waited. The ice cream man arrived on hot afternoons. Even the person collecting bottles for recycling came by regularly. The streets hummed with these small transactions, creating connections between households and the people who served them. Inside the house, the telephone, if you had one, occupied a specific spot, usually in the hallway, sometimes in the kitchen. It was attached to the wall by a cord, and it wasn't going anywhere. Making a call meant standing in that spot, or sitting on the small stool. Many families kept nearby for lengthy conversations. The receiver was heavy, made of Bakelite, and the dial required you to commit to each number as you rotated it. If you made a mistake on the 7th digit, you hung up and started again. Long-distance calls were expensive enough that you thought carefully before making them. Calling someone interstate wasn't casual. You did it for important news. For example, a birth, a death, a wedding. You kept it brief, 3 minutes, maybe 5. And if you needed to reach someone who wasn't home, there was nothing to do but try again later. No answering machines existed in most homes. No way to leave word except to call back another time or write a letter. When someone left the house, you couldn't reach them. They'd be back when they were back. If you needed to coordinate something, you made the plan beforehand and trusted everyone to keep to it. Money worked differently in practical terms. Banks were only open during business hours, typically 9 to 3 on weekdays, closed on weekends. If you needed cash, you had to withdraw it during those hours. You'd stand in line, present your passbook to the teller, and they'd stamp it with your new balance. Most people cashed their weekly paycheck on Friday and made that money last until the next Friday. There were no ATMs, no cards you could tap. Everything was cash. You carried your money in your wallet or purse and counted it carefully throughout the week. If you needed to pay a bill, you went to the bank or post office during business hours and paid it in person. Or you mailed a check. This required organization and discipline. You couldn't impulse buy. You had to plan your spending because once the bank closed, your money was locked away until Monday morning. In February 1966, Australia moved from pounds, shillings, and pence to decimal dollars and cents. Schools taught the new currency. Television ran information campaigns. On changeover day, everything was suddenly priced differently, and people had to relearn the value of things. Shops operated on strict timetables. During the week, most closed at 5 or 5:30 in the evening. On Saturday, many closed at noon, some stayed open until 1, and on Sunday, everything was shut. The entire country essentially paused. You couldn't pop out to buy something you'd forgotten. If you ran out of milk on Sunday morning, you knocked on a neighbor's door and asked to borrow some, promising to return it Monday, or you went without. Those were the options. This Sunday closure wasn't just tradition, it was law. In most places, trading hours were tightly regulated. Whatever the reasoning, the effect was that Sundays felt genuinely different from other days. Quieter, slower. Families went to church if they were churchgoers, which many still were. Late-night shopping was introduced toward the end of the 60s. Thursday or Friday nights when shops might stay open until 9. People treated it like an event. You'd go as a family, wander through the aisles, maybe stop for a milkshake afterward. Clothing and possessions were treated with more care because they cost more relative to what people earned. A new dress or a pair of shoes was a considered purchase, not an impulse. Children's clothes were often handmade or hand-me-downs from older siblings. When something wore out, you mended it. Women darned socks until the darn itself needed darning. Shirt collars and cuffs could be turned when they frayed. Hems were let down as children grew. A sewing machine wasn't a craft hobby, it was a necessity. Most women knew how to use one, and those who didn't wished they did. Men's suits lasted years, even decades. You owned perhaps one good suit for church and important occasions, some work clothes, and casual clothes for weekends. That was sufficient. The idea of a wardrobe full of clothing you barely wore would have seemed absurd and wasteful. Children occupied a different space in society as well. They had more freedom of movement and less supervision than would be considered acceptable now. A 5- or 6-year-old walking to school alone wasn't unusual. Groups of children would set out each morning, perhaps meeting friends along the way, crossing streets without adult supervision. After school, children played outside until dinner, roaming the neighborhood, building cubby houses in vacant lots, riding bikes on quiet streets. Parents didn't accompany them. Nobody thought this was neglectful. It was simply how childhood worked. The assumption was that the community was watching in a general sense. If a child was hurt or in trouble, someone's mother would step in. But mostly, children were expected to handle themselves, to navigate their world with independence that developed resilience and self-reliance. Television had arrived in Australia in 1956, but in the early 60s, many households still didn't own a set. Those who did had limited options, 2 channels in most places, 7 and 9. The ABC was there as well, but its programming was more limited and formal. You watched whatever was on at the time you turned on the television. There was no recording, no pausing, no choosing from a menu. If you wanted to watch a particular program, you had to be sitting in front of the television when it aired. The television itself was a piece of furniture, substantial and heavy, with a small screen by today's standards. It took a moment to warm up when you switched it on. The picture would gradually appear. Reception depended on your antenna, and adjusting the aerial was a common task. Someone, usually a child, would stand by the set moving the rabbit ear antenna back and forth while others shouted instructions from the couch until the picture cleared. Programming ended at night. After the late evening news, the test pattern would appear, a static image accompanied by a tone, and that was it until morning. Everyone watched the same shows because there was nothing else to watch. Graham Kennedy, Skippy, Homicide. If you missed an episode, you missed it. There was no catch-up. You had to be there. For entertainment outside the home, there was the drive-in cinema, which became enormously popular in the 60s. Families would pack into the car on Saturday night and drive to the outdoor screen. You'd pay per car rather than per person, so it was economical for families. The sound came through a small metal speaker that hung on your car window, tinny and not particularly good, but adequate. Children would sit on the roof of the car or spread blankets on the ground in front. The snack bar sold hot dogs, chips, and soft drinks. Between the 2 features, you always got a double bill. Everyone would stretch their legs, visit the bathroom, maybe buy ice cream. By the time the second film started, younger children would be asleep in the back seat. The drive-in was more than just watching a film. It was an event, something you looked forward to all week. The experience mattered as much as the movie itself. You'd see neighbors there, people from work, school friends. It was a social gathering as much as entertainment. Photography was precious in a way that's difficult to convey. You had a camera with a roll of film inside, perhaps 24 exposures, maybe 36 if you'd spent more. Each photograph had a cost attached to it. Film wasn't expensive exactly, but it added up, and processing cost more. So you thought before pressing the shutter. You composed the shot, made sure everyone was ready, held still, clicked. You didn't take 5 versions of the same picture hoping one would turn out well. When the roll was finished, you'd take it to the chemist. They'd send it away for processing, and you'd return a week later to collect your prints. That week of waiting held a particular anticipation. You couldn't remember exactly what you'd photographed or whether the pictures would be any good. When you finally opened the envelope and looked through the prints, there was always a mixture of satisfaction and disappointment. Some turned out beautifully. Others were blurry or overexposed, or someone had moved at the wrong moment. Photos went into albums, proper albums with pages you could write on. You'd note the date, the place, who was in the picture. These albums sat on shelves and came out when visitors arrived. The photos meant something because they were relatively rare. The post was important in a way that's difficult to appreciate now. Letters were how you maintained relationships with people who lived far away. If you had family in another state or overseas, perhaps relatives in England, Greece, or Italy, you wrote to them. Proper letters, several pages long, telling them what had been happening in your life and asking about theirs. You'd seal the letter in an envelope, address it carefully, put on the correct stamps, and post it. Then you'd wait. Interstate letters might take a few days. International mail took weeks or even months, depending on where it was going. When a letter arrived, it was an event. You'd recognize the handwriting on the envelope, feel a rush of anticipation, open it carefully, settle down to read. Letters were treasured because they represented effort and thought. Someone had sat down with pen and paper, composed their thoughts, and sent them to you across distance. People kept letters in bundles tied with ribbon, stored in drawers or boxes, rereading them over the years. Phone calls overseas were prohibitively expensive for most families. You made them only for emergencies or the most important news. The rest of the time you wrote letters. There's one more thing worth mentioning, something that shaped daily life profoundly but invisibly. Smoking was everywhere. In the 1960s, roughly half of Australian adults smoked cigarettes. People smoked at work, at home, in restaurants, on trains and buses, in hospitals, in schools. Teachers smoked in staff rooms. Doctors smoked in consultation rooms. Pregnant women smoked. Parents smoked around their children as a matter of course. Cigarettes were sold from vending machines in pubs and clubs. Children could buy them from shops, ostensibly for their parents, but often for themselves. There were no health warnings on packets, no graphic images, no plain packaging. Cigarette advertising was everywhere, on television, in newspapers and magazines, on billboards. The advertisements showed healthy, attractive people enjoying cigarettes in social situations. The link between smoking and lung cancer was known in medical circles by the 60s, but it hadn't fully penetrated public consciousness. Many people were simply unaware of the dangers. Smoking was normal, socially acceptable, even glamorous. The air in any enclosed public space was thick with cigarette smoke. Perhaps the biggest difference, the one that underlies all the others, was the way neighborhoods functioned. You knew your neighbors, not just the ones next door, but up the street, around the corner, throughout the suburb. You knew their children's names, what time they left for work, who had a vegetable garden, who made the best sponge cake. People looked out for each other. If you fell off your bike 3 houses down, someone would patch you up and send you home. If your father needed help with something, neighbors would appear with tools in hand, borrowing sugar, eggs, a cup of milk. It happened constantly. Fences were low, gates were open, and people actually talked. Not just polite hellos, but real conversations. This created a web of familiarity that held communities together. You weren't anonymous. You were known, seen, part of something larger than your individual household. This could be comforting or oppressive depending on your circumstances, but it created a sense of belonging that's rare now. We've built higher fences, both literal and metaphorical, and something has been lost in that privacy. These were the ordinary circumstances of daily life. Not remarkable, not dramatic, just the way things were. And because they seemed permanent, because they'd always been that way, and presumably always would be, nobody thought to preserve them or mark them as special. They were simply life. If you lived through this time in Australia, or if your parents did, perhaps some of these details will resonate with you. Perhaps you'll remember things I haven't mentioned. The particular smell of a corner shop, the sound of the bell when you entered, the way Saturday afternoons felt different from any other time of the week. What remains with you from that time? What small detail, what quiet ritual do you find yourself thinking about